understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged.
If you're listening to this, you are your resistance. Your resistance.
We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America.
It's a trap!
Welcome back, Truth Seekers. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm honored to have our guest. His name is Richard Weikart, who's a professor of modern European history at California State University. He's published numerous scholarly articles as well as 5 previous books, the most recent of which is The Death of Humanity and the Case for Life. But today, we're going to be talking about his outstanding work called Hitler's Religion, The Twisted Beliefs That Drove the Third Reich. Doctor, welcome to the show. How are you?
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So you make the case here that Hitler was an advocate of veganism, CrossFit, and yoga. I think a lot of people were surprised to hear that. So have you gotten any backlash from that crowd?
Well, I actually make the argument that Hitler was a pantheist, and I did have some backlash from that crowd, actually. There was a website about pantheism. Unfortunately, the person who gave the backlash had never read the book, so they didn't really know what the argument was. They'd just seen from a review that I'd claimed that Hitler was a pantheist, so they wanted to go after me for that.
As was said in a movie about Hitler, it's more fun to burn books than to read them. So I'm not surprised when some people have no interest in actually diving into it and cracking the spine. But I got to say, I wasn't able to put the book down. It's been fantastic. And one of the things that drives me is that I spend a lot of time online talking to people in atheist or agnostic channels. And it's interesting how many people believe if Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf or said in a speech that he had Christian values that he espoused, how we kind of just take that at face value and ignore the rest of the body of his work. You dive so deep into the other things that he did and said, I think this is a must read. So I want to start off with, is there anything that surprised you in your research about Hitler? Like what's something that stands out as, oh, you know what, I wasn't expecting to learn this, that you shared with us in the book?
Probably the most fascinating thing that I found was that I found a doctored photograph of Hitler. And I certainly wasn't expecting to find that. When I was going about looking for illustrations for the book, I was just thinking I'd just find some things that, they'll just illustrate some points I'm already making in my book. But I didn't really expect to find anything that was going to sort of add to the argument that I was making, or and illustrated so powerfully as this doctored photo that I found. So let me just describe this to you here real quickly and how I found it. I was getting a book from Interlibrary Loan called Hitler wie ihn keiner kennt, which means Hitler as no one knows him, which was published by Hitler's private photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann. And Hoffmann took this picture in 1932, as it turns out, of Hitler coming out of a church in Bremerhaven in northern Germany. And as I got this book and was leafing through it, I noticed this picture, and I thought, that looks pretty similar, I think, to the photo that's on a dust jacket of a book called The Holy Reich. And so I pulled this book, The Holy Reich, off my shelf and looked at it, and the two pictures had a glaring difference. And I was kind of stunned as I looked at the pictures. The picture from the 1932 edition, as it turns out, I'll give you sort of what I found out. Yeah. The picture from the 1932 edition, and also carried on to the 1935 edition of that book, has this white cross right above Hitler's head. And the caption to it says, a chance event becomes a symbol. Hitler, the supposed heretic coming out of the Marian Church in Bremerhaven. And so the lesson you were supposed to get from that was, look, Hitler has this Christian symbol right above his head. I mean, it looks like a halo kind of effect, right, of him there. And then the idea that the supposed heretic, it says there. So, Hitler is trying to make Hitler seem sort of Christian, or in line with Christianity. He's coming out of a church. So after all, it sort of implies that, he had gone to a church service there. However, in the doctored version, and as it turns out, I know that that's a doctored version. Actually, the original version with the cross actually looks kind of fake, but I wrote to the archives in Munich that holds those photographs, and they actually still have the negatives, and they told me that the cross is actually in the negatives, so I know that is the original. But then in the doctored version of it, which came out in 1938 edition and also in 1941 edition, the cross is gone, and they changed the caption, and the caption at that point says, Hitler after sightseeing in the historic Marian Church in Bremerhaven. So it makes clear that Hitler wasn't attending a church service. So it's trying to distance, and the cross is gone, so you don't have that symbol anymore there of Hitler being close to Christianity. So there's actually two different things you could draw from that. You could draw that Hitler changed his religious convictions, and there actually are a few historians who'd make that argument. But from my tracking of Hitler's religious views going back all the way to 1919 and 20, when he was making some statements in an essay on why we were anti-Semites and lots of other evidence that I bring forward, I argue that Hitler was simply using that cross over his head as a propaganda tool to try to draw in people who considered themselves Christians, but who were concerned about Hitler's anti-Christian. Notice that in that first that I mentioned that first caption that it said the supposed heretic, because there were a lot of people who were calling Hitler a heretic and noted his anti-Christian tendencies. So this was not unknown at the time, but Hitler did, for propaganda purposes, try to portray himself at times as being Christian. And that photograph was kind of a stunning example of that, I think.
Yeah, and I've been criticized when I spar with people online as saying, look, obviously you haven't read X or seen Y where Hitler said this. And my response is typically, all right, well, he fooled a lot of people back then, so welcome to the club. I mean, this is what he did. As I turn the pages of your book, one thing that I really took from this is I wasn't alive back then, right? And so we kind of assume that a lot of the cultural or the approach or view of religion was the same today then that it is today, and it turns out it's very different. I mean, I wasn't aware that the Germans were levying taxes on the people to support the church at the time. So membership was a de facto. Would you say that? Or I mean, people were just inherently members of the church because they were born there and they were supporting it through their taxes, which means that Hitler had a really strong incentive to make sure everyone knew he was on their side. Can you kind of elaborate on this a little bit?
Yes, the vast majority of people in Germany and in Austria, where Hitler was born, were basically born into the Christian church. I mean, unless you were a Jew, you were pretty much baptized as a Catholic if you were in Catholic parts of Germany, or as a Protestant in Protestant parts of Germany. It was extremely, extremely rare for someone to sort of buck society by not baptizing their child. So pretty much just about everyone was baptized into the church, and then you would pay taxes based on and the taxes went to the church that you were part of. So it was a state church there. There were some rare cases where people did leave the church. But even in the case, I give a case in there, for instance, of Ernst Haeckel, who was the leading Darwinian biologist in Germany. He was clearly anti-Christian throughout his entire adult life. But he didn't withdraw from the church until fairly late in life. So he actually stayed in the church, paying church taxes for a very long time, even after he was attacking Christianity for a long time. So the fact that Hitler remained a member of the Catholic Church officially throughout his entire life was not unusual. There were actually many agnostics and atheists who did the same thing. I also give an example in there of a famous hygiene professor named Max von Gruber, and I was going through some archives doing work on my earlier book, From Darwin to Hitler, and I came across this letter that he wrote to a friend of his where he said that even though he was anti-Christian and said he was promoting Promethean values, that's the word he used himself, Prometheanism, he said he was going to leave the Catholic Church, but he was not going to completely stay out of the church. He was going to join the Protestant church, not because he believed in Protestantism, but because for social pressure reasons. Basically, he didn't want his children to be ostracized. So there was heavy, heavy social pressure to stay in the church. And Hitler knows this, and that's why he himself did not withdraw from the church. Now, some of his close associates did withdraw from the church, like Heinrich Himmler, Alfred Rosenberg. Goebbels actually stayed in for the same reason that Hitler did. Again, propaganda reasons. You read Goebbels' diaries. Goebbels was intently anti-Christian, and at times he even complains that Hitler doesn't want him to leave the church because he did want to leave the church. So Hitler was doing this for propaganda reasons. In fact, Hitler even says this himself in Mein Kampf. There's a whole section in Mein Kampf where he talks about a Viennese politician named Georg von Schörnerer, who in the first decade of the 20th century led an anti-Catholic campaign called the Los von Rome movement, which meant the Free from Rome movement. This was in Catholic Austria, and it led to his political collapse. I mean, he just did a nosedive politically when that took place, and Hitler recognized that. So he knew, and so Hitler in Mein Kampf talks about how we shouldn't attack people's religious values, religious beliefs. We need to convince them, of course, of our own worldview, he said, but we shouldn't attack their religion overtly. So he was more interested in the sort of silent, the side attacks, sort of whittling away at Christian influence as much as he could over time. There's,
in terms of atheism, so my own thought process on this is oftentimes it's easier for me to believe that atheism was his default because my issue with atheism is not that they don't believe in God, it's that there's an entire moral code that comes along with believing in a higher power that gets thrown out the window. So sometimes I've criticized Sam Harris and saying you can criticize Islam because they do what they believe they should do and try to levy the same thing against Christianity when they don't do what they believe they should do. I think it's an inconsistency. So I apply that to Hitler and say, if he was Christian and believed in the doctrine, he would be doing Christian things and espousing Christian behavior. Those were an obstacle to Nazism. Your book actually influenced me a lot to say that neither one is true, and you go into pantheism and make those arguments. So for people who are unfamiliar with pantheism or why you can make the case for Hitler believing in it, kind of give me the 30-second overview as to what that is.
Yeah, pantheism is the belief that all of nature is God, the entire cosmos is God. And one of the corollaries that Hitler drew from that, as you're suggesting, is in relation to morality, that natural laws define what is moral. So he thought especially the Darwinian struggle for existence was an important natural law that had ramifications for human society. He thought there was a racial struggle going on. And so he thought that by destroying the weak and the inferior, those that he deemed to be inferior, he thought that he was helping nature out. And so he thought he was actually fulfilling a divine mandate by operating according to natural laws, which can be very cruel. And he says that, that natural nature is cruel. Animals get killed. And so we shouldn't be surprised this happens in human society too.
And then also, there's some things that really shocked me. Like, for example, I've got a couple written down here. The White Rose Resistance Movement at the University of Munich, 1942. So one of the arguments is, look, you've got a Christian nation full of Germans that went along with Hitler, that, lived adjacent to the camps and went home and ate dinner after murdering people all day long. Like, these are deranged Christians, and it's an argument why we need to get rid of Christianity because it can be polluted and they do horrible things. And then I look at some of the examples you gave, the White Rose Resistance being one of them, where he was basically killing off and removing dissidents from the start. And these were college kids. Am I wrong about that? Yeah,
the White Rose Resistance was largely college university students, although there was a professor involved in it as well. And they were based on Catholic values. They were very harshly critical of the Nazi regime and called Hitler a liar outright in their pamphlets or flyers that they distributed throughout Munich and southern Germany there. Concerning the question of Christianity and its relationship to the German people on the whole, I do my book is mostly focused on Hitler, so I don't spend a lot of time on that particular issue. But I do talk about the impact of Christian anti-Semitism on Hitler. And here's an area where, I think those that want to call themselves Christians, such as myself, need to do some soul searching and realize that, that what has gone under the guise of Christianity over the ages has done some pretty horrible things. And we all know the litany of the Inquisition, the Crusades, and other kinds of things like this, where Christianity did perpetrate violence for its ends. What's interesting about Hitler's own way of going about perpetrating violence, though, was that he was more interested in destroying a race, not a religion. Most of the kinds of Christianity, by the way, I should say that my own particular perspective, I believe that Christianity went off the rails with Constantine and Theodosius, especially in the late 4th century, who began persecuting non-Christians. But they did it for religious reasons. Hitler was not persecuting the Jews based on their religion. He didn't care whether a Jew believed in God, was an atheist, agnostic, etc. Freud was an atheist, but Hitler was just as opposed to Freud. Marx was an atheist. Hitler was just as opposed to Marx as any other Jew. He thought it was part of their biological makeup. So he was persecuting based on race. And so there's actually a big distinction between, say, Luther's anti-Semitism, and I'm not condoning Luther's anti-Semitism. It was horrible. Luther should have never said the things he did about the Jews. But Luther wanted the Jews to convert to Christianity. He wanted them to assimilate into German society. If they wouldn't, then he wanted to kick them out of Germany. But we should say that he also wanted to do that for Anabaptists and anyone else who didn't accept his own religious views. So there was no religious toleration in Europe during Luther's day, and you had to toe the line religiously, essentially. Hitler thought the worst thing that could happen would be for the Jews to convert to Christianity, because then they would bring in their supposedly evil, immoral, biological traits into the German people and corrupt them. And so there's a huge difference between the way that Luther wanted to treat the Jews and the way that Hitler wanted to treat the Jews.
Yeah, I'm kind of fascinated by the mindset that went into some of these people who had to choose who to follow. And I also want to mention the White Rose resistance movement ended with college kids getting guillotined. Is that right?
Right,
They
that's
got
correct.
Executed. Imagine if that happened today. So in 1937, it was Pope Pius who condemned the Nazis for persecuting the church and harassing the clergy. You wrote that when Hitler seized power in 1933 and for a few months thereafter, the Catholic hierarchy forbade Catholics from joining the Nazi Party. And I think it was Otto Strasser, if I'm not mistaken, who actually complained right after Hitler broke away in the early, or he broke away from Hitler, that Germany was comprised of Christians, and without Christianity, they were lost. Hitler was an atheist. So there were a lot of these people early on that saw Hitler for what he was. How did he overcome that? How did he use his pantheism and his symbolism to convince Christians to do horrible things with him? What can we learn
Well, in
from
the
that?
early phases, in 1933, right after coming to power, Hitler had to sort of forge an alliance with, or at least get the complicity of the Center Party, which was a Catholic party, as well as other elements within the Catholic Church, as well as the Protestant churches for that matter, to be able to pass the Enabling Act, to be able to take dictatorial control. And so what he did is he made all sorts of promises to them. For instance, just before the Enabling Act was passed, which was the act that gave him dictatorial powers for 4 years and then was going to later on be extended, of course, he promised the Center Party that he would not dissolve Parliament, that he would not dissolve the state governments, that he would give the Catholic Church freedom of religion. He made quite a number of promises to them in order to get them to pass the Enabling Act. And also, we should say that they were also frightened of his SA troops as well. So there was both terror and attempts at compromise going on here at the same time, which made the Center Party go ahead and vote for the Enabling Act. Then, in July 1933, Hitler signed a concordat with the Vatican, which likewise assured the Catholic Church that they would be given the freedom to worship, the freedom to appoint their own leaders, the freedom to continue their Catholic schools, which were very important to them, the freedom to continue their youth organizations. And so there were a lot of things in the concordat that gave the Catholic Church assurances that they were going to that as long as they stayed out of politics, that was their side of the bargain. They had to stay out of politics and allow the Nazis to rule Germany. As long as they did that, then they would have all these freedoms. As time went on, however, Hitler began whittling away at the concordat. So when Hitler believed that he had the ability to do so, he always was trying to whittle away at the powers of the Catholic Church. So over the course of the 1930s, they began shutting down Catholic schools. They began eliminating Catholic youth groups. And finally, by 1939, they made the Hitler Youth mandatory so that every German young person from the ages of 10 to 18 was required to be in the Hitler Youth. And the Hitler Youth did not allow anyone to belong to any other youth organization at the same time. So effectively, by the end of the 1930s, all the Catholic youth organizations were gone. This is why in 1937 already, the Pope issued an encyclical called Mit brennender Sorge, which means with burning passion or burning care, where he said that where he complained that the Nazis were violating the concordat left and right. In fact, there were dozens and dozens of violations of the concordat. So Hitler was violating this treaty that he'd signed with the Vatican and trying to undermine the powers of the Catholic Church as he felt he was able to do so. There were some episodes, interestingly, however, where there was some pushback. There were episodes where in the 1934, Hitler had a couple of bishops arrested, or when we say Hitler had it done, it actually was done by some local leaders. Hitler was behind the scenes, not officially promoting that, but there was street demonstrations by the German people in favor of their bishops, and Hitler had to back off. However, so Hitler actually kept his hands off of most of the bishops, both in the Catholic and in the Protestant churches throughout the Nazi period, and so sometimes they were able to make protests against Nazi policy. However, there were 700 Protestant pastors that were arrested in 1937. There were other hundreds of Catholic priests that were arrested over the course of the Nazi period. And interestingly, once Hitler annexed Austria and annexed parts of Poland, those parts were not put under the concordat, and the Catholic Church was persecuted even more harshly in those areas.
That was the same for Czechoslovakia and Hungary and the subsequent countries as well, right? I mean, was it Poland where they went in and just started executing priests as soon as they invaded, or I'm thinking Czechoslovakia? I'm getting mixed up.
No, that was in Poland. In Poland, there were Einsatzgruppen or commando units that were sent in behind the regular forces, and they had lists of tens of thousands of people that they were supposed to execute. And on those lists, some of them were Catholic priests. It wasn't all Catholic priests. There were prominent Jews, there were trade union leaders, communist leaders, socialist figures and such. But there were hundreds of priests on that hit list as well.
Yeah, you said something during your answer that I think is worth pointing out, that it's kind of like, how Fidel Castro died and you've got hundreds of thousands of Cubans mourning in the streets, just like when Kim Jong-il died. I mean, a lot of these people, once Hitler took power, were very afraid not just to visibly oppose him, but to let anyone know that they had that they didn't feel very strongly about Hitler. Would you say that was kind of the culture of fear at the time, where a lot of these people kind of were shepherded to supporting Hitler tacitly for fear of retribution?
That's part of it, but there's with many dictatorships like this, and especially in Hitler's case, there's sort of the carrot and the stick approach. I mean, Hitler, when he came to power, began pushing for public works projects and such, and took credit for the economic upturn, which some historians dispute that he was really responsible for it. It may have happened whether he was in power or not, but of course he's going to take credit for it. And while the rest of the Western Europe and the United States was languishing in the Great Depression, the German economy began booming by the mid-1930s, and by the late 1930s there was actually labor shortage in Germany. So Hitler, of course, is going to be hailed as an economic savior as well. So there's that, together with the fact that his police forces are clamping down on any kind of dissent that's public, is going to contribute to his popularity among a lot of the people, as well as intimidation.
So I think one of your stronger arguments for Hitler being a pantheist is that he was very tolerant personally of religious diversity. It seems like that he didn't really care what religion the people were that surrounded him. He liked to make sure he was dismantling religion and kind of defanging it in these countries that he took over. But you have some pretty strong examples that as long as people didn't cross swords with his ideology, he kind of didn't really mind what they personally believed in. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. And that's one of the reasons why I argue that Hitler was more influenced by secularization than by religion, because he didn't really care whether his associates believed in astrology or the occult like Rudolf Hess did, or like Heinrich Himmler did, or if they were neo-pagan, into the neo-pagan religions like Alfred Rosenberg was, or if they called themselves Christian like some of his Gauleiter did. There was a wide variety of religious positions being taken by various people in the Nazi hierarchy, and Hitler didn't really care so much as long as they towed the line in this world. He didn't care what they thought about the next world, as long as they did his will in this world. And so he basically was claiming, and that's why he butted heads with the churches, because the churches were making claims about this world. When they were making moral claims, that's claims about what we should be doing in this life and in this world. And that's where Hitler was coming into confrontation with the churches, when the churches were making claims about morality.
Yeah, I think that's a very strong argument. I mean, if you're a part of identity politics today, if you're a Christian or an atheist or any other sect, you do care very much what other people in your group think and say and do. So I thought that was a pretty strong argument. In terms of the religious culture at the time, it was very, I think it's very different than it was today. These emerging secularists and philosophers, and Nazism kind of had this tinge of secularism that grew over time. Can you help someone like me understand what the prevailing wisdom was, or some of the religious trends that affected Hitler and the time that he took over?
Well, in terms of the secularizing trends, throughout the course of the 19th century, there had been a number of movements that had tended to secularize things somewhat. Interestingly, in the early 19th century, the Romantic movement actually was a reaction against secularization, against the Enlightenment period, and there was, interestingly, a good bit of pantheism there, and I argue that was one influence upon him. But interestingly, Hitler's favorite philosopher was Schopenhauer, who was an atheist, who believed that there was this sort of impersonal will that was behind everything in the cosmos. And Hitler was going to draw upon those ideas of the will, which also were felt in Friedrich Nietzsche's writings later on. Nietzsche himself was influenced by Schopenhauer. but took things in a slightly different direction, but also an atheist. So here we have actually two atheist philosophers that Hitler admired. In fact, Hitler calls Schopenhauer really his favorite philosopher. He claimed that during World War I, he carried Schopenhauer's works around with him in his backpack. But then also when the Nietzsche archives Hitler supported, he actually gave of his own personal funds to the Nietzsche archives. There's a famous photograph, and I have this photograph in my book, Hitler's Religion. The photograph is of Hitler at the Nietzsche archive, across from a bust of Nietzsche. So Hitler wanted to be associated with Nietzsche, even though he knew, of course, that Nietzsche was an atheist. So again, there's all these secularizing tendencies that are feeding into him. Ernst Haeckel, who was the leading German Darwinian biologist of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, likewise identified himself as a pantheist, even though his pantheism was very close to materialism. In fact, a lot of people accused him of being a materialist, philosophical materialist at the time. And there was sort of a dispute over that. But he called himself a pantheist, usually because he thought that nature was God and that there was some kind of will in nature. But again, he thought the will of nature was just natural laws, the laws of nature. And I think Hitler's views were very close to that as well.
My own personal belief, and you mentioned it earlier when you talked about Constantine and kind of the pollution of early Christianity and where that road leads, is that because of the mysticism and the liberal theology and some of the other things you talk about in your book, when Christians don't have a strong hold on what it is they believe and what the biblical precepts are they're supposed to be following, it makes it much easier for them to be swooned by this kind of secular Christianity and this political Christianity. I feel like anytime that's present, you're much more susceptible to being part of a movement that's going to do harm to the group at large. Would you agree with that? Do you think that's something that played a major factor in Hitler being able to sway so many people to do what he asked them to do?
Oh, certainly. But in the 19th century, another huge secularizing tendency I didn't mention was the growth of liberal Protestantism. And in fact, Richard Steinman-Gall, who in his book Holy Reich argues that Nazism was closer to Christianity than many of us would care to think, and his book, by the way, has been widely criticized by many historians. But nonetheless, he even admits that liberal Protestantism was the closest form of Christianity to the Nazis. So most of the people who identified themselves as Nazis and who called themselves Christians generally tended toward liberal Protestantism. And one of the reasons is because liberal Protestantism cut itself free from the Bible. And if you look at Hitler's own views, too, Hitler had utter contempt for the Old Testament, which he considered a completely Jewish document. And interestingly, Hitler also had contempt for Paul, the Apostle Paul, whom he claimed was a sneaky rabbi who snuck in these Bolshevik views. That's what Hitler even calls it, that. These Bolshevik Jewish ideas into Christianity, smuggled them into that, and corrupted Christianity from the very start. So Hitler did not believe the New Testament either. He thought most of the New Testament was written by Jews, and so he thought that even that was corrupted. Interestingly, however, Hitler and many anti-Semites in the early 20th century did think that Jesus was not a Jew. They considered him an Aryan fighter, and one of Hitler's favorite stories was of the Jesus in clearing what Hitler called money-grubbing Jews out of the temple. So it portrays Jesus then as being a strong, heroic, fighting figure. Such Hitler didn't like the Sermon on the Mount too much. So what you're saying is right. I mean, once you dispense with the Bible and don't hold to any kind of objective truths in Scripture, you can pretty much go wherever you want. You can pretty much buy into whatever political ideology happens to be in sway in that particular age. And Hitler thus was able to play upon these notions of appealing to Jesus on the one hand, but sort of creating his own Jesus. I mean, it's not the Jesus that the Bible portrays.
Right. I think you referred to it in the book as an amalgamation of Nazism and Christianity, whereby he was promoting certain Protestant candidates as well for political positions. He was bringing them to the cabinet. I think I read in your book that he changed national themes or slogans like Ein Volk, Ein Reich, Ein Gott to Ein Volk, Ein Reich, Ein Führer, kind of
That's
this.
Right.
If you are a Christian, you believe that the opposition basically mimics the truth, right? It's just it looks like the truth, it sounds like the truth, but it's not. It's a mockery of the truth, or it's a counterfeit version of it. And you see Hitler doing that a lot, like in the Hitler Youth song. We are the joyful Hitler Youth. We need no Christian virtue. So everything kind of sounds and feels the same, but it's Hitler's Jesus and it's Hitler's ideology, which you make the case is not religious at all, and it's not even atheist; it's pantheist. What else is something that if someone reads this book, what are 2 or 3 of the main tenets you want them to take away, or they're going to get out of reading it, aside from what we talked about?
Yeah, well, I think one of the most important points is that once you buy into false religions, such as pantheism, as in Hitler's case, you end up dispensing with some of the most important values that we have in Western civilization that have been handed down through Judeo-Christian morality. And so Hitler totally dispensed with you shall not kill by defining certain individuals and races as inferior. And what's interesting is that I think we see these same things going on today.
100%.
I think there are some parallels, and it's very difficult to talk about these things because anytime you talk about Nazi parallels, people automatically invoke Godwin's law. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Godwin's law is the law that political discourse always degenerates down to someone calling someone else a Nazi or referring to Hitler. So it becomes very difficult to draw these parallels. But nonetheless, I think there are ways in which in contemporary society we denigrate certain groups or individuals. Now, it's not the same ones the Nazis did. It's not the Jews that we're targeting. Well, there are some people in the alt-right, perhaps, who are. I shouldn't say perhaps. There are people in the alt-right who are. But they're still fringe. At least I hope they're still fringe, although they're getting a lot of publicity these days. But there are other categories of people that we're sort of denigrating and considering non-persons. And today we're wrestling with, for example, the assisted suicide bills and such. So people with terminal illnesses or people nearing the end of their lives, people with disabilities. And people with disabilities is one that the Nazis themselves targeted, and we're targeting them too. A lot of times we're targeting them before they're born by abortion. But nonetheless, we're targeting these people by claiming their lives have less value. And that seems to be one of the most important points about the problems with Nazism is that it saw certain people as being less valuable, certain people as being unequal with the rest of us. And so this whole notion of equality, I think we need to really latch onto. And again, I've been doing some reading last few days about the alt-right, and one of their main things that they oppose is equality. And I think, in my opinion, that's one of the most important things we need to hold on to.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you on that. I think it's disturbing that the right is attached to it because I don't think it's going to be a productive long-term movement, and I hope that it fizzles out. But I see a lot of similarities. And in terms of the thing you said, I mean, yeah, you've got abortion, you've got assisted suicide, and then you've got the flip side of that where they're promoting, and you see this in the church as well, they're promoting alternate lifestyles, they're promoting deconstruction of the family, they're promoting gender constructs. And to me, it just seems like the perfect stew for people to completely apostatize from the faith and then be susceptible to believing whatever they think is good and calling it Christianity. So
yeah, and one of the points I make too about the morality too is that there are certain ways in which Hitler and Nazis tried to play on Christian morality, such as opposition to abortion, and say, look, we oppose abortion too. But in reality, they didn't oppose abortion. They only opposed abortion for healthy German babies. They didn't oppose abortion for the Jews or for the Poles or for others that they identified as racially inferior. So they tried to look Christian in certain contexts and morality, but the morality was really had a completely different basis. Yeah.
Kind of reminds me of Margaret Sanger, right? Abortion's a good thing for some people.
Right.
I can't let you go without asking you about the anti-Semitism. This to me is fascinating because Hitler didn't love Christians, hated Jews, talked about how Christians were the offspring, the bastardized offspring of Judaism. But also today, what I find so interesting is that secular Judaism is so prominent, right? I mean, most Jews in politics or in the news, and maybe it's because of the industry, happen to be secular leftists. And so why, okay, and actually let me preface this by saying I was watching an Auschwitz special the other day on Netflix, and they're interviewing these old German Stasi guards and saying, look, do you have any remorse? And some of these guys are laughing about what they did, and they're cold and coarse about it so many years later, while others actually do lament it and say, look, I have been taught from the day that I can remember that Jews caused all of our problems. They wrecked the economy. They made us lose the war. They're the reason we're suffering. We don't have farms and jobs. How many years did this predate Hitler? I mean, he obviously hated Jews, but I don't understand where this hate and resentment comes from. I know he took advantage of it, but help me understand that mindset and where that originated during the German time.
Yeah, well, the hatred of the Jews goes back centuries, in fact. And if you go into medieval times and early modern period, a lot of it was based on their religious differences. So because the Jews refused to convert to Christianity, that's the way that the Christian society viewed it, as they refused to convert, because very often there were attempts to try to convert them to Christianity. They were seen as recalcitrant and non-Christian. They were, interestingly though, however, given a measure of toleration some places and sometimes. It varied from time to place. But on the other hand, there was a lot of persecution that went on religiously too, because no other religion was tolerated in most of Europe throughout the Middle Ages and on into the early modern times. So there were some very horrible episodes, for instance, even during the Crusades, where Jewish populations were targeted in Europe before the Crusaders ever got to fighting the Muslims. So the anti-Semitism that was in Europe in the Middle Ages on into the early modern period did come out of a context of religious intolerance. In the 19th century, however, there was a key shift, because with the secularizing tendencies in the 19th century, a lot of thinkers began to get rid of the idea of religiously persecuting the Jews, because they themselves were abandoning Christianity and religion on the whole, moving toward a more atheistic or agnostic or sometimes pantheistic. That was not an unusual view at the time. So because of these secularizing tendencies, they began to construe the Jews, they began to adopt some of the same stereotypes of the Jews, these stereotypes of the Jews as being greedy and deceitful and other kinds of things were common stereotypes of the Jews that had developed over the centuries, in part, by the way, because the Jews were the only ones who could lend money in the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church forbade usury, so the Jews were a convenient source of money for a lot of kings and such, and they became some of the bankers. Not that they dominated the banking system in the 19th century. There were plenty of German bankers around at the time by the 19th century, but they still did have a significant niche there in the banking industry. So they're viewed as being these greedy capitalists. And so these stereotypes had been developed over centuries. By the 19th century, there comes a shift, though, where it becomes more secular, and people begin interpreting their various moral traits as being biologically determined. And so the idea was that these Jews are biologically inherently immoral, greedy, deceitful, and all these other things, the stereotypes. And so, therefore, converting them to Christianity or to anything else, for that matter, would be fruitless in trying to rid society of these sort of negative traits. And so this is why Hitler thought that he had to either deport the Jews, get them out of the country, or ultimately to annihilate the Jews, was because that was the only way to get rid of their, what he saw as inferior and negative and even immoral biological traits. So ironically, Hitler thought that by committing these horrible atrocities, he was actually making the world a more moral place, because he was getting rid of these immoral people.
Yeah, which is truly fascinating to me. And I'd recommend anyone who thinks they know Hitler's religious background and the tools and symbols he used to persuade others to support his agenda to pick up Hitler's Religion by Dr. Weikart. It's called The Twisted Beliefs That Drove the Third Reich. Fascinating read, excellent book, and I think you'd be foolish not to pick it up and educate yourself on how Hitler really got things done and how his religion affected that. So, Doctor, I appreciate your time. I'm so glad that you wrote the book, and I'm curious, do you have anything in the works, or are you just taking a little breather?
Well, I've got a number of things in the works, but I'm actually sort of shifting gears a little bit. I'm working on a documentary relating to the Reformation and religious revivals in Germany that I'm going to hope to work on next year and hopefully have out before the 500th anniversary of the Reformation.
Fantastic. I mean, there's 50 pages of notes in here, so just that part was exhaustive, but I'm grateful that you took the time to write this book, and I hope that everyone will take us up on our generous offer to make sure they read it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you, Doctor. Have a good one.
Okay. Bye.
You're listening to the absolute unadulterated truth, courtesy of the Oh Hail Yeah Show. Want more? Hail yeah, you do.
I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to the Young Cons podcast on iTunes or SoundCloud. And make sure to check us out online at youngcons.com/podcast. Or chat us up on Twitter at RealTJHale.
But I'm a big fan of money. I like it. I use it. I have a little. I keep it in a jar on top of my refrigerator. I'd like to put more in that jar. That's where you come in.